Anesthesiologists have been called to the front lines of the war on COVID-19 for a simple yet vital and dangerous job. They operate ventilators, one of the top weapons in fighting severe cases of this new coronavirus. Joining us for more on this is Dr. Dion Ibeke, an anesthesiologist from Illinois in the United States. Thank you for joining us. Let's begin with what's happening in the U.S. Despite the high number of deaths, some reports are saying that there are signs that the U.S. has avoided the worst-case scenario. What do you think?
Well, I think it's too early to declare victory. We are still very much so in the midst of a pandemic. As of today, the number of cases are 1.6 million, and we have 95,000 deaths, and we are rapidly approaching 100,000 deaths. It is true that major cities like New York, Chicago, New Orleans are seeing a flattening of their curve, but it's also true that in rural America, they're seeing spikes and increases in cases. The other thing is certain demographics are disproportionately affected. Native American communities, Latin Americans, African Americans have been disproportionately affected. So right now is not the time for us to get comfortable. We still have a ways to go.
Doctor, intubation is a key part of what anesthesiologists do, and when a person can no longer survive breathing on their own, you're called on to intubate them. Tell us about the process.
Yeah, so as anesthesiologists, prior to surgery, we are responsible to render a patient unconscious with medication, and those medications also inhibit their ability to breathe. So we every day intubate patients for surgery. And because of we do it every day, we are also called in emergency situations when patients are in distress. And we're seeing a lot of that in this COVID-19 era. So what is the process? When we are called into the ICU or the emergency room, we assess the patient. We check their hemodynamics, their blood pressure, their heart rate, and that helps us determine the dose of medication that we give. And then we use a device called a laryngoscope, which is similar to a flashlight. There's a blade and there's a light at the end. And that allows us to have direct vision of a patient's airway. And once we see it, we place a breathing tube down the airway, and that attaches to the ventilator to breathe for the patient. As you can imagine, that puts us in close proximity to a patient's airway, exposing us to droplets. So it does make us very high risk for exposure to the virus. But since we're the most skilled at this procedure, we are the ones called to the front lines to do it.
Well, I was going to ask about, what it would require to learn using or operating the ventilator. Would a few weeks cut it? And this is looking at what we're experiencing in Nigeria. We're still having limited equipment. Ventilators are needed. And then we also have a few people who can adequately operate one.
Yeah, so, realistically, it does take training. You go to medical school, you go to residency, and then certain specialties like ICU physicians and anesthesiologists truly are the experts in knowing how to use a ventilator and knowing how to manage patients on the ventilator. However, desperate times calls for desperate measures. And so in the United States, where we were having our healthcare systems overwhelmed in hotspots, we used a tiered approach where we had the ICU physician who's trained in the ICU at the top of the tier. Then anesthesiologists were kind of the next in line, and other physicians. I would say, sure, anyone can operate a ventilator in a few weeks, sure. But it's managing a specific patient and, knowing what specific, dialing the ventilator in specific ways to manage the patient. That's what you need to learn how to do. And physicians as a whole have had some exposure to ICU patients during their medical training. So if you have the ICU physician or the anesthesiologist at the helm leading, and they can easily teach and remind their medical colleagues how to manage the patient on the ventilator. And then the other thing is calling people from other less affected areas to more affected areas to help is another strategy that can be used during a pandemic. And lastly, using technology. I know it can be limited, but wherever you can, using telemedicine, having tele-ICU physicians helping to manage patients is also useful during this time.
All right, we'd like to appreciate your time and continue to stay safe. Dr. Dion Ibeke, anesthesiologist from Illinois, the US. Thank you for joining us.